Good afternoon. The fourth installment of this dialogue series is entitled The Polycrisis of Carbon Democracy Towards a New Global Transformative Social Contract by the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung, Southern Africa Regional Office. My name is Refiloe, Joala. I work in the Food Sovereignty Program Foundation. Thank you to everyone who's joining us here in person today, and all of you who have joined online via Zoom. This series is organized by my colleague, Fredson Gilene, who heads up Synthetic Affairs and History and Remembrance Program here at the Foundation, with support from many other colleagues in the office. Today's dialogue on democracy in the context of post-apartheid state capture and anti-constitutional ideologies in South Africa is presented by Dale McKinley. We're honored to have you, Dale. Thanks for coming and to be part of this dialogue series. But before I hand over the floor to you, I would like to take the time to introduce you to our participants in this event. Dale T. McKinley is an independent writer, researcher, and lecturer, and presently Research and Education Officer at the International Labour Research and Information Group based in Johannesburg. He holds a PhD in International Political Economy and African Studies. He's a longtime political activist who's been involved in social movements, community and liberation organizations, and struggles for almost 4 decades. The author of several books, Dale has written and researched widely on various aspects of South African and international political, social, and economic issues and struggles, and is a regular public speaker as well as contributor and commentator in the media. Please note, we'll open up the floor for questions and comments for participants here in the room as well as online once Dale has completed his full presentation. Thank you, Dale. I'll now hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And thank you so much to Rosa Luxemburg for inviting me and having this opportunity to speak to what is obviously a very timely topic. I've been told by the organizers that 95% of you are online. So we have a very small group in front of me here, which is great. But it seems like it feels like COVID again in some ways, like small amounts of people in the room and everybody's online. But thank you so much for everybody for taking the time to come and listen. I've been given just around an hour or so to give this presentation. And let me just say from the outset that Rosa Luxemburg chose the title for me and asked me to speak to this topic. And as you'll see when I go through here in terms of particularly around the issue of the Constitution and anti-constitutional ideologies, we have a very sort of specific take on that. But in order for us to situate the post-apartheid reality in democracy, it's necessary for us to paint a historical context and picture, because this did not, what I'm going to speak to and the democratic dispensation, the constitutional dispensation in South Africa, the issue of state capture, none of this happened in 1994, just started in 1994 in the post-apartheid era. And so to understand what has happened since 1994, it's necessary for us to go quite a bit of a ways back, in particular with regards to the key political party that has been ruling South Africa up until the recent national election, the African National Congress. And I want to go right back, and don't worry, I'm not going to, the historical context will just be a primer to get in, but it's necessary to cover some ground, which is to go right back to the formation of the ANC, which is over 100 years ago. And as has been widely chronicled, both in the literature as well as otherwise, the majority of the founding members of the ANC were drawn from what was then a newly emergent black petty bourgeoisie, along with traditional chiefs. And this is important because in many cases, in many ways, the formation of the ANC was tied to the economic interests of this leadership and group, which was basically related to the availability and use of land in particular because of the issue of apartheid land dispossession. The core reason for the establishment of the ANC in many ways, I would argue, was to create a political and organizational means to stem the assault on those interests, on those class interests in many ways, and of course, of what they saw as the general political and economic well-being of the Black population. In other words, to move towards a deracialized situation politically, where South Africa could have one person, one vote. Coupled to this, the early leadership of the ANC brought with them a particular class politics that was heavily imbued with quite a very narrowly conceived Christian or Calvinist education and corresponding social mores. This led to a perspective, I argue, which is crucial in understanding state capture and post-apartheid democracy, of a politics of what I call incorporation and accession, in which the main priority was not fundamentally to overthrow the political and economic system and to implement a revolutionary new system, but was essentially to deracialize and access the existing system itself. And you could see that in the ways in which the early mobilizations and the early kind of politics of the ANC was. In other words, as applied to their own economic interest, the leadership of the early ANC wanted a specific section of the Black population to become an integral part of the capitalist system, right from the beginning. This was the foundational setting for what was much later to become the approach to Black economic empowerment, which is at the crucial heart of state capture and of the whole story of how not only the state, but the party, capital, and the state, the nexus, relate to each other. What made this appear quite, how should we say, secondary in a way for such a long time, essential to the overall liberation strategy, was the fact that the macro-nationalist politics of the liberation movement, as occasioned by the ANC being the main liberation movement, provided a sense of collective and predominantly, understandably so, racial ownership over the emerging struggle against the racialized organization of South African society. In other words, from an early stage, the concept of political freedom for all Black South Africans was aligned to a nationalist politics that accepted the capitalist class system. This is fundamentally important to understand how things moved from there. Flowing from this, there was a parallel acceptance of the specific and dominant need for the economic empowerment of those class of the Black population that could join and eventually replace white capitalists as the precursor to wider scale economic empowerment of the Black majority, i.e. workers and poor. There were few better expressions of this than exemplified in the remarks of Dr. Zuma, who was not Jacob Zuma, but the ANC Secretary General in 1945. And I'm quoting directly, which aptly captured the ANC's historic politics of accession and incorporation. He said, "It is of less importance to us whether capitalism is smashed or not. It is of greater importance to us that while capitalism exists, we must fight and struggle to get our full share and benefit from the system." 1945, the Secretary General talking of this. This conceptual understanding and practical line of march was then consolidated, and here's the important theoretical underpinnings, if we want to historically theorize this. This was consolidated in the 1960s in the SACP's 1962 program, The Road to South African Freedom. And then it was codified in the ANC's 1969 Strategy and Tactics document. These two documents were crucial in the more later years. Here, the theorization is fundamentally important. The new basis for the pursuit of Black economic empowerment was set against the theory of colonialism of a special type. What was the core argument here? The core argument was that apartheid emanated from an era of monopoly capitalism and that South Africa reflected, and I'm quoting from the document, a combination of the worst features of imperialism and colonialism within a single national frontier, end quote, in which Black South Africa was a colony of white South Africa. As the African population was seen, and I'm quoting, and this is crucial, as having no acute or antagonistic class divisions at present, unquote. In other words, a seamless identification of all the Black populations being part of common and oppressed class, it was only logical that the immediate task was to fight for national liberation of the colonized.
So the logic is quite clear. How is this going to be carried through? This was going to be carried through by the second part of the theory, which is the National Democratic Revolution. And how is that going to manifest itself? Through a multi-class liberation movement, the ANC being the main one, acting as the main vehicle, but with the working class, in this case, at the time, the SACP was its professed political vanguard, constituting the leading revolutionary force within it. This was the theorization. So, since not all classes had an objective interest in the fundamental transformation of a post-apartheid South Africa, i.e. a non-capitalist society, the leading role of the working class would ensure that the liberation struggle could be extended to socialism. Therefore, the National Democratic Revolution then moves into the two-stage theory of revolution. Thus, the struggle had two stages. The first for a national democratic state, non-racial, non-sexist, as you know, in the Constitution. The second for a non-capitalist, under the general rubric of socialism society, which would come at some point in time down the road. The result of these historical developments was that by the time this serious and sustained mass struggle began to take place against the apartheid system in the 1980s in particular, the ANC's path to power and the liberation movement's path to power, and I say the ANC because it was by that time the dominant form of the liberation movement in terms of the party, it was wrapped up in what I would argue is a hopelessly contradictory liberation theoretical and practical paradigm. What was that? National liberation was analytically and practically circumscribed. In other words, the political side, the struggle for democracy and democratic power, became detached from the economic side, the struggle for social and material power. And the two became completely detached. As a result, the whole idea of Black economic empowerment would necessarily come to practically be implemented as part of a deracialized capitalism after political freedom. Remember the two stages, in which the logical aim would be the empowerment of an emergent Black capitalist class, a public and a private bourgeoisie, in other words, as a means of overcoming racial oppression. And here it's interesting to see, even though at the time neoliberalism was just beginning, the theory of capitalist neoliberalism was just beginning to really become dominant in the 1980s. But there are quite a number of parallels in the metaphorical sense between the neoliberal kind of conception and this theoretical conception, which is really a top-down, a trickle-down approach. That you deal with these things first at the top, you deal with the state, you deal with those, you empower a particular class of individuals, and then that then drives a process of redistribution, and it trickles down to the majority and the poor. So in some ways, it's ironic that in this case, the empowerment would trickle down to the Black majority, who, and here was the sort of logical leap, which of course, in retrospect, becomes quite difficult to sustain analytically and practically, which is that this entire theoretical and practical construct rested on a massive assumption. And that was that at some point, this working class and poor, which had trickled down, would then take command of the situation, would then move to the front politically and economically and overturn the capitalist system, and thus also overturn the newly empowered Black capitalists that have just constructed it. Because you can't have socialism, you can't have an equality without overthrowing all capitalists and all the capitalist system, whether Black or white or whatever the color and racialized nature of it. So in some ways, if you think about it logically, it's an absurdity. It's an absolute absurdity because you're basically arguing that you're going to build a system, a capitalist system, you're going to deracialize that capitalist system, but the political and working vanguard is going to be here in the background, is going to be empowered as a result of this. We're not told exactly how, but through democracy, through the right to vote, so forth and so on. And then at some point, they're going to be able, socially, politically, and organizationally, to move and to conquer power through the state, it would be assumed, and move the society towards a non-capitalist direction, towards a socialist direction. Of course, that has not happened. It's not even come close to happening. But yet we have not really interrogated, in many ways, 30 years later, oftentimes the theoretical and practical underpinnings for this. And as a result of that, state capture and post-apartheid state capture is oftentimes seen in an ahistorical context. And it's almost seen as though it's about individuals. It's about bad people doing bad things. And when you get rid of those bad people, then you can, and because there's this constitutional bedrock with the rights and everything else, it's just a matter of adhering to that constitutional framework and getting rid of the bad apples, and then we'll be on the right track. And I would argue that that is a fundamentally mistaken, both in theoretical and practical terms, assumption. So what this picture I'm painting, this historical picture, what it represented above all, was the embracing of what I have called, and this I'm just referring to, some of you will know that this book that I wrote a few years ago called South Africa's Corporatized Liberation, a critical analysis of the ANC in power. And I basically argue in here that what this represents is an embracing of a corporatized path to power. And you'll understand why I say that just now, wherein popular democratic will and choice, right, through elections, in other words, the institutionalization of democracy, which is important, and we'll look at that importance, but essentially that popular will and democratic choice is substituted for elite will and choice. In the case of South Africa's liberation struggle, the leadership of the ANC in this particular case presented their own choice of strategic path based upon their own interpretation of objective realities and the balance of forces as the only route the liberation struggle could take. Those of you will know in the early 1990s, in the late 80s and early 1990s, when the movements were unbanned and CODESA was put in place and the negotiations started formally, there were many, many critics. There were many people within the movement who said, hold on, this is not the way that we should be going, because it's outside of the realm of popular will. It's outside of the realm of popular organs of power that were built in the 1980s. It's behind closed doors. Elites are going to decide what it is that we can and cannot do, and what we do and do not give up, and what compromises can and cannot be made. But the leadership essentially at that time presented it, and this was fundamentally important to understand what happened afterwards, as the only route that could be taken. There was no other choice. There was no alternative. To do so would have had a civil war. That was one of the reasons that was given, that if we had gone too far. Two, that international capital was too powerful. The forces of international capital would have smashed South Africa's economy, and which was already pretty much smashed anyway. If you want to look at in the early 90s. And here's the trick. Here's the logical and conceptual trick that was played, that I call it, which was that was quickly transformed into the will of the people. This became the will of the people, this only route that would be able to take place. And anyone who was critical and dissenter of that was marginalized immediately. And we have, right from the time back in the 80s and the armed struggle and contextualises, whatever it is, we have many, many examples. I don't have time to go into that. So this rhetorical sleight of hand, the will of the people, provided confirmation, I would argue, of the leadership's historic practice of substitutionism, substituting their will for the people's will, essentially. As in the case, and here's the corporatized nature, as in the case of the corporate world, this kind of practice privileges existent and the aspirant elite, i.e., those who already possess and those who have the means to access political and economic power, who want to access it. It privileges that over the contingent power of the majority, of the mass. So what you do is you turn your gaze. We're talking about power and understanding balance of power and balance of forces. What you do is you turn your gaze to existent power. You don't turn your gaze to contingent power. And masses didn't have the contingent power. There was the possibility, depending upon organization, depending upon mobilization, depending on strategy and tactics, other kinds of things, to fundamentally shift what was an unequal balance of forces, no doubt. But the leadership essentially looked the other way. And I argue it turned its back on the mass. And the mass then becomes, becomes a tool to be used, depending upon the circumstances, to be, as one analyst put it back in the day, a tap to be turned on and off, depending on how you need it. In other words, and what this led to the needs, interests, and struggles of the majority, who are, of course, always mostly workers and the poor. In South Africa, we know this historically, being treated as secondary or ad hoc requirements to a much more important and instrumentalist access to the use of structural and institutional political power, i.e., the state. The state becomes the locus of power. The state becomes the means of accumulation. The state becomes where you're going to turn the society around. And this is, I would argue, a lacuna that the left in this country has still not grasped. We still look to the state. It's always the state. It's always the state. And without understanding the origins of that state and the origins of the class nature of that state and how is that, and the assumption is we'll go into the state and we'll be different. We'll change it. This is what most parties that move in this direction always argue and get people to vote for them. We will do this. And we see this 30 years later. There's new parties that are making the same pledges. Get us in there and we'll revolutionize the society. We'll change it for the workers, the poor. Unfortunately, the practice is a very, very different thing. So finally, just to end this sort of historical, contextual laying this foundation, the picture that I painted was and still is presented as the natural state of things. It's the way things are. This is part of what neoliberalism does. It crushes any idea of any alternative, of anything that is, and it crushes the confidence of the working class and poor people to say that you cannot move. You cannot take on the power of capital. You cannot do these things. Therefore, the only thing that you can do is mitigate it. You can create barriers in the way and try to get a better deal. This is the way things are. And it's not surprising given the elite's ownership of and control over political and economic terrain on which the chosen path traverses. You choose the journey you choose the path that you're going to follow, and who makes the rules and control, well, the outcome is going to be fairly predictable. It then becomes much easier to understand why there was a parallel embrace of a deracialized capitalism, which could only allow for two things to happen. And this takes us into the post-apartheid period. One is the ascension to political power, in this case of the ANC, it could be another political party, under a dispensation of majority rule, with democratic elections providing the necessary stamp of approval for a journey whose macro direction has already been decided, socially and economically. That's the key point, is that the democracy is not necessarily a democracy in the sense of elections and one person, one vote was a major, major victory and a triumph in many different ways. But placed within the larger context of the journey that and the foundation which I've just outlined, it had the effect of essentially providing cover, democratic cover for a right-wing turn and an embrace of a capitalist system that it was never and has never and will never be a friend of the working class and the poor in this case. The second thing that it could only do, besides that, was to create and then incorporate a new class of capitalists, predominantly black capitalists in this case, and political entrepreneurs into the existent economic system, which of course was dominated by white capital. And you'll see when we come to the state capture and the use of the rhetorical white monopoly capital and all these other have just been completely manipulated to completely just obliterate this history. As if all of a sudden white monopoly capital is the main enemy, and it's about replacing them with black monopoly capital or with others in the name of the poor and the working class. So how is this deal sealed? And this is where we now go into the post-apartheid period. I want to start with the announcement by de Klerk. Everybody remembers that day, 2nd of February, 1990, when he announced the unbanning of the releasing Mandela, unbanning the ANC, and the other liberation movements, the PAC, the SCCP, and so forth, and a host of other allied organizations, and opened up the terrain for a negotiated end to apartheid rule. Now, that can be interpreted, and it was interpreted and has been interpreted as a victory of sorts, because the anti-apartheid forces had forced through sanctions, through armed struggle, through a whole range of different tactics to put the apartheid state onto the negotiating table. But there is another side to this story, which is oftentimes left out. And this story, for me, is the confirmation of where the capture really started in the post-apartheid period. But its origins and roots lie pre-1994, which is the confirmation of corporate capital's effective capture of a long-planned political process towards a post-apartheid South Africa. Way before the Guptas are small fry in relation to this corporate capture that took place in many cases. For all the ideological, political, and military battlegrounds that have been traversed over the previous decades, it was the core interest of corporate capital that won the war right there at the beginning. How did this happen? And there's a lot more to this, but I'm just isolating a couple of examples. 1985, most scholars will remember, and most activists in the movement will remember, 1985 was the Rubicon speech of P.W. Botha. You remember the Rubicon speech? They were in the country was in crisis, state of emergency, pushing. There was a whole range of things, and Botha retreated back into the lager, the apartheid lager. What did he say? He said, and I'm quoting, "I'm not prepared to lead white South Africans on a road to abdication and suicide," unquote, warning that the apartheid state's critics should not push us too far. So he was basically rebuffing any attempts at that time of reform and everything else. The reason why this is so important was this was the last straw for corporate capital. They realized at that point, if they hadn't before, they needed to seize the moment and the initiative. Within days of the Rubicon speech, international financial institutions announced a massive freeze on loans to the apartheid state, and a delegation of the who's who of South African capital, Anglo-American, Premier Group, Barlow Rand, Sam Land, Barclays. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? They're still there. Today, 30 years later, there's still the dominant, just a few names differently. Where did they head off to? They jetted off to see the ANC leadership in Lusaka. And asked what the talks would be about. This was very interesting. The time Anglo-American CEO Gavin Riley, who was the Anglo-American CEO, said this, and I'm quoting, "I think that there is a coherent sense for businessmen to want to find out if there's common ground, that a free enterprise society is demonstrably better than some type of Marxist socialism. I would have thought it was self-evident that nobody wants to play a role in a country where the economy is destroyed by either a sort of Marxist approach to wealth creation or by revolution." This is Gavin Riley, CEO of Anglo-American in 1985. After the talks, Riley and company were equally clear that they felt they could now work with the ANC to ensure, as another Anglo-American put it, quote, "We dare not allow the baby of free enterprise to be thrown out with the bathwater of apartheid." In other words, yeah, we want to get rid of the racialized system of apartheid. It's bad for business, but we don't want to get rid of capitalism at all, obviously. Gavin Riley said on SABC radio that he got the distinct impression that the ANC leadership was, quote, "not too keen to be seen as Marxist." And he felt they had a good understanding of the need for free enterprise. Okay, now they were playing politics, of course. And I remember Oliver Tambo had right after that tried to sort of push back a little bit. But the scene was set in many ways. So the bottom line here was that the liberation struggle's endgames of both corporate capital and the liberation movement in the form of the ANC were coming ever closer together. Even if some of the leadership, and certainly the rank and file, many of the rank and file desired a non-capitalist post-apartheid South Africa, democratic non-capitalist post-apartheid South Africa, the strategic logic of the ANC's National Democratic Revolution conception, coupled with the economic vagueness of the Freedom Charter, which we still has not been grasped, the people shall, the people shall, the people shall, but with no specific end about how that's going to happen, which is still trotted out as the sort of like ideological cover for everything. Well, of course, we're trying to, we're trying to help the people own the wealth, which of course doesn't happen in any meaningful way. The combination of these two things, political democracy and continued economic autocracy. Yeah, get political democracy, but economic autocracy. That was what the deal was pretty much about. Now, it took the better part of 4 years for the apartheid regime to finally come on board. And we know what happened in the early 90s. We don't go through that whole thing. But it's interesting to just look at some of these historical and these back things, because the transitional program that was proposed by de Klerk was in full compliance with what corporate capital had laid out in 1986. It was almost a cut and paste of what corporate capital has said 4 years later. Despite, it was the releasing, unbanning the organizations. And here's the quote: "A democratic constitution," I'm quoting, "a democratic constitution, universal franchise, an independent judiciary, the protection of minority as well as individual rights, freedom of religion, and a sound economy based on proven economic principles and private enterprise. Read capitalism." That was what that was the transitional program. Now, the tragedy is is that if you look at that, the vast majority of it, that's what's come to bear, in the sense of it's not a bad thing to have the universal franchise, it's not a bad thing to have a democratic constitution, but do you see where the trajectory of how things then became so, the expectations and the vision and the terrain of what was achievable became so small? It became, that's what now we've achieved. We've won freedom because we have a democratic constitution. We have one person, one vote. Woo, that's it. And that's not to say that a lot of people agreed with that at the time. It was not the case. But whether or not there were some, or the rank and file or others supported this, or were in full agreement, that's moot in some ways, because they had been, you know, in many ways, while there was a certain objective reality that people had argued that they had been hurried up by the combined push of a difficult international context, the fall of the Soviet Union, the ideological confusion, all of these things that have been written about greatly, about the reasons why, the role of neoliberal, the dominance of neoliberal capital, and so forth and so on, the ideological vacuum that was created, the failure of socialism, actually existing socialism, and so forth in USSR and Eastern Europe. All of these things aside, it was more than anything else, it was the cumulative impact of the own choices of the liberation struggle strategy and tactics that congealed with corporate capital and with the state, in this case, the dying apartheid state, which then handed over things. To put it bluntly, here's the summary. Both historically and in the present, the dominant ideological frame of the liberation struggle as represented by the ANC has always been one of class aspiration, going right back. That is, it is ultimately defined by the interests of the class, which most of that leadership want to join, which is the capitalist class. This was and remains framed by nationalism, which provides the political rationale for the pursuit of a deracialized but recapitalized society. What emerges from this is an approach to liberation and to democracy that orients towards, as I mentioned, existent dominant political and economic power, which is the state and capital, as opposed to the contingent power, the majority, the workers and the poor. Within this frame, access to and control of state power through the political party form becomes the main vehicle and guarantor of the new class formation and accumulation, as well as taking the helm of the political custodian of the new nation. The will of the people, it's us. We are here. We have delivered freedom for you. Listen to us, wait for the delivery. And that's the scene that was set. So let's then move and ask ourselves, what type of democracy has this produced, and over the last 30 or something years or so? An aspect which is oftentimes relatively ignored. I'm just going to remind myself of my time frames. I'm doing quite decently, and I hope the storyline is of making sense in the sense of the key aspect of the negotiated compromise, which is not paid attention to. Oftentimes, the political economic trade-offs, the constitution of private property, this is paid attention to, but the one thing was the system of governance that was agreed to, which was a federal system of governance. In other words, as opposed to a single unitary state, South Africa would now be divided up into specific provinces, each possessing a range of separate powers and functions alongside the existing national government. And additionally, then there would be local municipal structures that were also endowed with extra powers and responsibilities as per the Constitution. Now, there has been some debates over the last 30 years about this, but they've generally taken place in the shadows, and they haven't gone into the mainstream. We've accepted that this is the way things are. This is the governance model, and that it cannot change. Well, that's not the case at all. This is a very specific choice that was made with specific compromises for specific reasons. And this set a scene. So combined with, and here's the interesting historical parallel with what we have now. Remember, this was combined with the acceptance of a government of national unity for the first 5 years, from 1994 to 1999, where the National Party would be set. There was a set amount of seats, the IFP and all the rest of these parties would be part of this, if you remember, in which there would be co-governance status, as well as economic compromises that were agreed to. What was the collective result of this? Was that there was a great deal of continuity in South Africa's overall governance model from apartheid to post-apartheid. The South African house, metaphorically, with a few pre-handover changes and additions, was being bought as is. It was being taken over as is. This had huge implications, massive implications for what we're talking about here. So in practical terms, this meant that the new state, now run by democratically elected government with Mandela as the president, the ANC black majority rule, had precious little governance space to affect any kind of immediate structural and personnel changes in the state itself, right? Related to those areas most in need of change. So the upshot of this was that the new ANC state, or the new ANC control state in this case, or the dominant ANC, wasn't certainly in total control, was left with only one real option: to set about shifting the governance and policy veranda chairs. You shift them around and create new rooms in this metaphorical house in order to try and facilitate movement towards addressing the various rights that were now in the Constitution, as well as the secondary mandates of the new democratic dispensation as evinced through the constitutional order. Even on this front, though, appearance of things most often did not correlate with reality. So let's give a couple of examples, a few examples. The task of replacing a predominantly white managerial, technical, personnel, bureaucratic apartheid state at all three levels of government was the least controversial. This was the least controversial transformation of the people who were running the state. This happened fairly quickly and over a long period of time. Unsurprisingly, then, this was engaged right from the start, even if on a much more gradual scale at the first few years due to the GNU agreement. But crucially, when it came to the most politically and economic important state entities, national finances and treasury, security and intelligence services, defense forces, state-owned enterprises, and the justice and court system, there was virtual stasis for a long time. This was crucial. This allowed apartheid-era politicians, bureaucrats, officials, judges, spooks, and soldiers to thus act as the main enablers and or teachers for most of the newly appointed public servants. In other words, in the foundational phase of the new South Africa, the previous culture of governance, which was not only racist, but secretive, corrupt, and everything else, it was riven with internal, hierarchical, technocratic, class-based, non-responsive, top-down, was largely passed on and relearned. In many ways. There are exceptions to that, but this is crucial in understanding then what happened later on. Central to this house redesign, I'm using the metaphor of the house, was the drafting and passing of a range of new legislation at all levels of the state to give effect to these various components of the Constitution, and more specifically, the Bill of Rights. We can't have time to go through that legislation. And while it was much of it was necessary, and no doubt many of those involved did so with the best democratic intentions, what this resulted in was the setting up of a sizable range of new provincial and local state administrations, departments, representative bodies, district councils, provincial parliaments, public service entities, local water boards. Accompanying this was also the creation of new national departments, such as development agencies, Chapter 9 institutions, the HRC, the public protector, all of these things, right? That now make up the constitutional frame or the architecture of trying to implement these paper rights. For the most parts, this was all understandable, and in many cases, somewhat necessary to deal with the expanded governance mandate and have some kind of independent oversight of the state, as well as to implement or try to implement the delivery of basic services to previously unserviced areas and communities, mostly rural and township areas. However, there was a generalized lack of a parallel drive at the same time to transform governance service culture. Bato Pele notwithstanding. Remember Bato Pele, the sort of short-thrifted, public relations-driven program that came out and then somewhat disappeared very quickly. And there was also a lack of to try to create avenues for more direct democratic participation oversight of those being governed and served. In other words, participatory democracy, not simply representative democracy. Since there was very little movement on that front, the result was what should have been a prime opportunity to create a new governance model and associated public service ethos to deepen the democratic content and process, the promise of some of the constitutional measures, instead became, over time, largely an avenue for what? inter-party political deployment, patronage centered on accumulative, both in terms of power and money, personal interests, factional interest, and class interest. This was only further fueled by the decisions on, and here is something that is also overlooked, that we overlook right from the beginning, which set the scene, was the decisions on remuneration of officials and politicians. The commission that sat in 1995 made a fundamental mistake, which is it set salaries of politicians and officials way up here, way above the people, so that access to these becomes part of a competition. It becomes not about service, it becomes about serving your own interests, it becomes about getting the job in order to get the money in order to live a particular lifestyle. And this has driven right through the last 30 years. And that's why, in many cases, that those decisions, we saw the awarding of huge public sector salaries and innumerable perks. I wrote in about 15 years ago when we uncovered the ministerial handbook. Remember, it was secret for many, many years, and we uncovered it. And there was an outcry when people found out 10 years later, after 94, what the ministers were getting. It's incredible. It reads like a fantasy novel. If you imagine every single thing that you want, you'll get, including paying for your parties at your own home as well. That state will pay for that too. So this was a fundamental reason, and well, it set the scene, should we say, for what was to come. Thus, from the very start of the accession to political power, democratic, no doubt, but the leadership opted for consciously constructing a massive material and class division between themselves and the ordinary people of South Africa. Put differently, they were quickly captured, not primarily for the benefit of the governed, but for a new class of corporatized elites. In turn, this provided fertile ground for seeking political offices, whether in the party or the state, as the main non-private sector ticket to wealth. Scene is set. So what kind of capture now we're moving? What kind of capture are we talking about now after this, what kind of democracy, what kind of capture? To situate this discussion, we must understand fundamentally that throughout history, since the capitalist system began to surface in the world and began to become dominant, corruption has always been at the center of capitalism, at the center. It is the sine qua non of capitalism, in fact. There's not about bad people, bad things, good capitalists and bad capitalists. It is at the fundamental logic of capital is corruption. Because of the insatiable drive to reap profit at any cost. And we've seen this in terms of climate change, in terms of the environment, in terms of the medieval slave-like conditions that we still see today of workers and others in places where capital seeks the lowest common denominator and a race to the bottom on every single front. So we don't need confirmation of this again and again. We can see it in front of our eyes all the time, every day, to further exploit human and natural resources. What's crucial, though, in terms of our argument and presentation is that the center of that pursuit is an ideological and financial capture. The successful outcome of a corrupting process. That's what capture is. It's a corrupting process, and then you capture whoever it is you're trying to, is the state, the person, the party, whatever it is. So the ideological and financial capture of dominant political parties, that's the first stage of capture. Not the state initially, it's the party. You capture the party. And you capture the leadership of the party in particular in power. And that's also what you then do if you're successful in doing that. You also capture the institutional purpose and policy direction of the national state. That's what you do. That comes logically from the first level of capture to the second. And in our context, this is most often and most effectively realized everywhere, not just in South Africa, through individual and class corruption of leading party politicians, state bureaucrats, and officials. Simply put, the corporate model, both in South Africa and always, has always been and remains synonymous with corruption. Now, given the post-apartheid, what I call the get out of jail free card that the ANC gave itself, in other words, nobody gets, who's in jail? For after all these years of all these things, 30 years of it, hardly anybody. I mean, Tony Ngeni is probably, you go back to that Tony Ngeni example, is probably the one, oh yeah, okay, there's a couple of people there. The acceptance and endorsement of the continued dominance of the economic realm and the dominant politics of accession and corporation, the result is that corporate capital's model has found a sympathetic and participative partner in the form of the ruling party and the state, and other people who then fight for the crumbs that come from the table, other political parties who want, and others who want a little bit of piece of the pie in the game. As a result, and I'm using another metaphor, what this has produced is it has become increasingly like a two-headed parasite attached to the very heart of South Africa's post-apartheid political economy. Like every parasite, feeding off of its host, it attracts other parasites. And if left untreated, it multiplies and soon enough overwhelms the host. That's what happens. This is what has happened to South Africa over the last 30 years. And I'm going to give you one case study which I think captures this entire story, and is Glencore. Yeah, remember the Glencore? Well, we were just at Glencore head office the other day protesting around the export of coal to Israel to continue the genocide in Gaza and against the Palestinians. But this is a long story. Let me just give you the short version of Glencore. Let's go back to the 1970s and 80s. That was a time period that everybody knows when the apartheid regime and its agents were engaged in systematic economic crime to bust sanctions. They were trying to, every single way to bust sanctions, to buy favors abroad and fund their dirty tricks campaign at home and in the region. And they did this. What this did was to create parallel criminal networks between the state and the private sector. So the sinews of state capture were started in the 70s and 80s by the apartheid state itself, in this case, which in turn provided ample opportunities for small groups of individuals in the state and in the private sector to use the cloak of secrecy to steal vast amounts of money, move it overseas or into private bank accounts, and do whatever they wanted. Who was at the heart of this? Mark Rich, who founded Glencore. Oil trader. He was a big mover and shaker, and he founded in 1974, Glencore. After fleeing the United States, by the way, in 1983 on tax evasion charges. Yeah, he fled the U.S. on tax evasion charges, ended up in Europe and established Glencore. This is what corporate criminals do. Yeah, they flee from one jurisdiction, open up shop in another one. Gupta's is a classic example, as we can see in the more contemporary period. So Rich set up shop in Switzerland, and he soon became indispensable to the apartheid regime's oil for cash global criminal network. Not long before his death in 2013, Rich admitted in an interview that his relationship with the apartheid state was, quote, my most important and most profitable business, and that bribery had played a large part in making Glencore so successful. And then he died. And Glencore continues to do the same thing. The end of apartheid was not the end of Glencore's relationship. And here's the kicker. Through various subsidiaries and partner company, notably the mining firms of Trafigura and then later Extrata, Glencore emerged as a major player, particularly in the mineral sector and mining and trading. This is despite the criminal past and the central role that it played in oiling the apartheid machinery. Now, here's where it makes the most sense, which is that as the mining sector became the centerpiece of the ANC's Black Economic Empowerment Program, they chose the mining sector as the main vehicle for BEE. And we can see it. Our own president, that's how he made his money. That's how Patrice Motsepe, the richest black capitalist, has made his money. We can see it everywhere. This is where mining has become the main thing. So when they chose it, so too did Glencore, now run by Rich's protege, Ivan Glassenberg, become further enmeshed with leading ANC figures. When Glencore bought out South Africa's biggest coal mining operation, Optimum, which supplied coal to Eskom in 2012, remember those years? None other than BEE kingpin and ANC leader Cyril Ramaphosa was appointed chairperson of Glencore. Yeah. This is not where the story ends, though. It keeps on going, which is that in late 2015, Glencore sold Optimum to the Guptas, to Tegeta Exploration and Resources, a company set up by the Guptas, close links with the ANC and then state president Zuma. And the shady deals and business deals with his family have been at the forefront of South Africa's political discourse for the next several years. And we know this story. But I just love this little sort of side story, which was this transaction when the Glencore sold. If you remember this, it should have come as no surprise that the then the Department of Minerals and Resources Minister, remember Moussa Ben Zwane? Remember him? He's still there. Had earlier flown to Switzerland to meet Glencore CEO Glasenberg, and that just 3 weeks before the purchase of Optimum, half of Tegeta's shares were transferred to a company owned by President Zuma's son, Dudazani. So you can see, this is just a classic example. This is not certainly one of the biggest ones. Connect the dots and the linked picture of pre- and post-apartheid 1994 corruption, and things become quite clear. In the words of Open Secrets, the collective that has done a lot to uncover this, in no small part, the massive incidence of economic crime that plagues our democracy today is a result of our failures to dismantle the criminal networks that thrived under apartheid. This is why the adoption of GEAR, which was the classic neoliberal trickle-down framework, and then the vigorous pursuit of corporate-friendly policies that flowed from it, is so central to understanding the continuity of capture in South Africa. We cannot paint that picture without understanding that. All of this paved the way for a wide range of beneficial transactions. We know all of these things between the ANC, the state, the donor countries, as well as connected politicians, officials, corporate capitalists, and so forth. But here's how they was covered. In the world, organizational as well as group and individual class interests are attached onto the formal institutional world of foreign and domestic capital investment. So in this way, the state, in this case, the ANC-run state and its leaders, are able not to camouflage the commonality of interests and associated corruption that legally fuel the expansion of patronage networks as normal business. That's one of the mantras of corporate capital. Corruption is normal business. It's just normal. It's the way things are done. You're being naive if you don't think that's the case. That's what they tell us. So I want to quote, just to end this section and then go into the final one, I want to quote our ex-president Zuma, because this just captures it. He was at a Progressive Business Forum, 2015. It was a gala dinner of the Progressive. You paid about $1 million to sit at the table. $2 million maybe if you were sitting at the head table. This is what he said. It's classic. I always say to business people that if you invest in the ANC, you are wise. If you don't invest in the ANC, your business is in danger. The Treasurer General is a nice and handsome young man. When he knocks, open the doors. If he says we need something, he will ask one thing only. If he says support the ANC, just write a blank check with the instruction that it should be 6 digits. This organization does not make profit, but we create a conducive environment to those who do make profit. Once you make profit, you know what to do. That's ex-President Zuma, 2015. Don't have to say much more. So the last section is what I call the constitutional end game, because here we come back to this notion of anti-constitutional ideology. It's within this history and contemporary realm of reality that we must assess what is termed in the title of the talk, anti-constitutional ideologies. Before we do that, it's just to acknowledge, because I know that when we do this, I always get accused of being so negative and not understanding, not profiling some of the positive aspects of these things, which I've tried to do. But let's just specifically acknowledge some of the more positive aspects of the South African constitutional frame and order. The potentially positive ones are the ones that have at least been barriers to the worst excesses. An institutionalized democratic system based on non-racial ideals and a constitution which legally affirms these social and economic rights, the right to citizenship regardless of race, ethnicity, or geographical location, linked to the right to vote, to form political parties, to participate in elections, have political representation. These are not minor things, they're important. Protection against unfair discrimination, but these are all in the Constitution based upon race, gender, sex, marital status, ethnic, social origin, sexual orientation, age, disability, conscience, belief, and culture. All of these are there. And other important constitutionally sanctioned civil and political rights, including the right to assembly, demonstration, just administrative action, access to information, freedom of expression, religion, language, movement, residence, the media, and security of the person and privacy. So there's quite a link there. We also have a range of judiciable socioeconomic rights, including supposedly the right of access to housing, water, food, healthcare, social security, and education, as well as a safe and healthy environment. Again, these are in the Constitution. Noting, by the way, as we always have to, that most of all those judiciable socioeconomics are subject to available resources, which of course is a crucial thing. But here's the main catch, having recognized that. The ability of the majority of the population given the history that we've painted, the workers and poor, to access and enjoy all of these various rights, in a phrase, to access justice, social and economic justice, that are contained in the Constitution, the ability to do that is directly tied to political and economic position, power, and wealth. That's the catch. If you're poor and you're working class, most of the constitutional rights, sorry, they're going to pass you by. So, as such, if the dominant lived experience of the majority is one of endless frustration at the lack of practical assistance and effective redress in their search for justice and equality, then it is inevitable that the very value of the Constitution, its stated inclusive rights, and legislation that's supposed to give these rights legal and practical effect will come into serious question. They will not mean anything to people practically, even though they're meaningful on paper. This is precisely what has happened. As a result, in metaphorical terms, while the post-apartheid journey has seen some internal improvements and external additions to the House, that is South Africa, the House itself rests on rotten foundations that have not been addressed. Those rotten foundations have not been addressed. The House is teetering. The House is unbalanced. It's teetering. And most of the improvements and additions have not been designed for the majority of the House's inhabitants, but undertaken largely without their involvement for those that sit in the penthouses of the House. It is this consciously constructed, combined, and uneven House development that is the main marker of South Africa's post-apartheid constitutional dispensation architecture. The same division between the political and economic has come to represent the constitutional promise versus the constitutional practice. And as a result, it comes into question. It then becomes vulnerable. So on this terrain, what do we then witness and continue to witness are that political and economic elites pick and choose which aspects of constitutional democracy they want to apply. Some apply to them, some apply to others, some don't apply, some get thrown out the window, and what parts of the democratic process they want the rest of society to enjoy. For example, the terrain of participatory democracy that is a promise of the Constitution has been laid to waste over the last 30 years and politically manipulated. And as a result of all of these things, not surprisingly, the ANC has hemorrhaged political authority and popular support, which is what we've seen in the last elections. There's been a thinly disguised contempt for democratic oversight, equal application of the law, increased securitization of the state and society. All of these have become the hallmarks of contemporary South Africa. Even more fundamentally, though, there continues to be the rise of a politics of arrogance and elite entitlement to maintain power at whatever cost. Remember, we'll rule until Jesus comes. Well, sorry, ex-President Zuma, it wasn't the case, but now he's going to try through another political party to see the same thing. Predictably, though, here's the catch in terms of these institutional ideologies, is this is translated into opportunistic and hypocritical attacks on the Constitution, notwithstanding the legitimate and necessary critiques of the Constitution. So people oftentimes, it's not a black and white issue here in the sense of that. But these have been particularly frequent over the last few years from the likes of ex-President Zuma, the MK party more recently, and others. These do not constitute any specific ideology. Let's be clear. They do not constitute an ideology. They are rather nothing more than demagogic political posturing to try and take advantage of the majority's legitimate skepticism of the Constitution. And to try, as Gwako Ramatlhodi said, and I'm going to quote here because this is the classic rationale for what we're seeing in these anti-constitutional ideologies. This is from Gwako Ramatlhodi. Remember him? Former Premier of Limpopo and then the minister. In 2011, he tried to make it appear as though the Constitution was the problem. He argued that the key reason why the ANC in power has been unable to effect radical change is because it accepted a constitution that, quote, shifted substantial power away from the legislator and the executive and vested it in the judiciary, Chapter 9 institutions, and civil society. So that's the problem. The Constitution is the problem because it's taken power away from us to have more centralized power and more undemocratic power and give it to the people. Oh, wow. Isn't that quite some kind of logic? They called it the emptying out of the state. And this is precisely what we now see in Zuma and MK and others reviving this very same argument. What these attacks really represent, and here's my last point, is a means to try and gain political support that will then hopefully translate into access to political power. These attacks are consistent with the historic and ongoing politics of incorporation and accession that we started with from the beginning. But more than that, they also represent, and here's the really very worrying for any progressive person and any person who considers themselves on the left, is they represent a much more bold and clear surfacing of a fascistic politics that now seeks to delegitimize democracy in every single aspect in the name of the people, and to concentrate political and economic power on an even greater scale, but without the nuisance of a constitution. So even doubling down, it's like Trump. You double down in there. And that is a very worrying development, because that then means that even with all of its problems and with all of the issues that I pointed out with the Constitution and democracy, we won't even have those as barriers anymore. It'll just be pure unadulterated power of those elites, those demagogues and others. I hope that the story that I've painted is one that makes not only sense, but is one that allows us to interrogate. And no doubt there's going to be debate and some disagreement here, which is great, because we need more of that in terms of our discourse, but allows us to situate where we are by looking and understanding where the past and how this came about, and not having this very narrow view of state capture, of corruption and everything else, and to understand the systemic roots, and to understand that the only way that we're going to root it is systemic change. Thank you very much. And I think
yes,
right on time.
You're right on time.
Right.
Right on time. Thank you so much for this illuminating and really insightful reflections, even some of the troubling and challenging insights that you've shared about political power in South Africa and how it's operating. At this moment, we'll be taking questions from the participants. We're going to start off with the participants that are joining us online, and then I'll collect a few questions here in the room, and we'll try to address those in batches. Thanks.
Thanks, Neil. Just have a comment and a question. I'll start with the comment.
Sure.
It's from Lara Reddy. Rampant individualism, a symptom of neoliberal capitalist accumulation, profiting of patriarchy, racism, war, and ecological destruction. South Africa has become this, I agree, right down to the basics of how we treat those in our community, our neighbors, to how we show solidarity to the other internationally. And then I'll just go into the question now. This is from Anonymous. What role from late apartheid to today have Black trade unions played in our post-apartheid economy, from the Vehan Commission to COSATU, if I'm correct?
Okay.
Thanks, Vivian. We'll move on then and take questions in the room. Maybe 1 or 2 questions for this round. I see a few hands.
Thanks, Dale, for that wonderful presentation. Really just unmasking what the ANC really is, which I really think is quite a rare thing to experience, actually. My question is actually exactly on that, on what the ANC is. We have the Freedom Charter around the 1980s, if I'm not mistaken. And how does this influence the ANC that we knew from the beginning that was this petite bourgeoisie set up, right? And then we have again the ANC that comes into power, and despite the GNU, we have the RDP, even though that was short-lived. So my question is, there's this narrative around the 2 ANCs, right? And you also spoke about ideological capture, which the one famous faction has taken over, you know, radical economic transformation versus white monopoly capital. But are those legitimate descriptions of the 2 ANCs? Are there 2 ANCs? And is there even today actually a part of the ANC that is possibly still socialist? Yeah, that's my question.
Thanks. A few questions there.
Thank you for this inspiring lecture. Very even though, as you rightly indicated, not much to look forward to, but still it gives hope, because I think it is necessary to understand the roots and also the context properly. And I think this is especially important because whenever I talk to people, for instance, in Germany about South Africa, the ANC, especially only recently with regard to the upcoming elections, they always ask me, when, has the ANC taken the wrong direction? And I think it is so important to refer to what you said about the systemic roots of the ANC policy and what they are standing for. So for me, that was enlightening again to hear about that, and also helps me to translate better, the challenges here and how they are related to also the historical context. And my question is, and it relates to the question from our anonymous online participant. I mean, you described, or you always said, like, the ANC back then, or now the dominant party leading processes. What do you think? What was the role Labour did play in that process? Can we blame them? Can we? I don't know. That would be my my one question. And then also looking forward, what could the role be Labour can play to systematically change things in South Africa?
Okay.
Thanks. There was one more hand at my left.
Thanks, Dale. And for anyone who hasn't read the ANC in the Liberation Struggle, that was your first book, I believe.
Yes, 97. Yeah.
I think that was the most read book at the Wits Library for quite a long time. So read it. There's a little punt. Now, saying all of that, I just want to give maybe an alternative explanation for the longer period, the historical forces which brought us to this day. And for each one of the junctures that you said, from the 1945 period to the Stalinist period in the 50s, into the liberation struggle in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then the post time, it seems to me that all of those can be explained simply by the politicians and the ANC leadership, like people have done in other places in the world, simply took the option of least resistance. So during the liberation struggle, for example, the ANC was both dealing with the West through the anti-apartheid movement. That was something which had no real impediments. But at the other time, the Soviets were quite happy to throw open their armor and give support. Again, we move to our current epoch, the 1994 time. The resistance to actually implement socialism at the time, as you alluded to, that took a lot of effort to actually go down that route. It was much easier to go on the neoliberal vibe. Corruption. Doing things in the state to actually prevent corruption is actually quite a difficult task. A lot of places struggle with it. Take the option of least resistance. Why haven't we seen massive changes in the economy? What's the benefit of people? Why do we have every small town a horrible, desolate township attached to it? Well, to change all of that takes a lot of work. So again, the option of least resistance. So I'm just putting up maybe, just as an alternative. I'm not sure I really believe it, but I mean, I'm just put it out there.
Okay. Okay, that's quite a few things. I'll try my best to address these, and obviously, just with the writer to say you never can, I'm sure, address all of the aspects of these questions, which are very good. I think we'll start with the issue of the trade unions. Let's start with those because there's two of them. I failed to mention in the context, and I do so in the books and other things, is when I refer to the ANC, I mean the ANC alliance, because one cannot separate, particularly in the pre-1994 period, and even mostly still today. I mean, I think all of us sort of scratch our heads and wonder how the reason why the alliance is still there 30 years later, or 60 years later, or whatever. So when I in many ways, what I was talking about included particularly the Communist Party, and with some exceptions in between where, for example, in the early 1990s, when Chris Hani was the general secretary, where there was the promise or possibility of something very different before his assassination. But be that as it may, the role that trade unions have played, well, I think it was obviously two different kinds of roles. The role that the labor played in particularly in the 70s and 80s, I mean, this is well documented, written, chronicled in terms of the rise of the new trade unions, independent, and everything else. I think the fundamental mistake of the trade union was to ally itself with a political party, with a particular political party right from the beginning. So when COSATU was formed, there was a major, major step forward in terms of working class organization and everything else. But the alliance with a particular political party got caught up with it in the end. It just took another 10, 15, 20 years, or actually not even that long. So that, I think that was the crucial problem, was that because as any unionist will tell you, as any worker representative will tell you, when you are bound to an alliance with a political party, and then a political party that comes to power, right? Then you're bound to all of those things that political party then chooses to do that are not in the interest of workers, that are not in the interest of the union and your members. And we've seen this playing itself out. We could mention many examples with, for example, as I'll come to that in the post-apartheid period. But I think fundamentally also the other element, so the unions played a really, really important role in providing an alternative pole, in providing an organized, disciplined, inclusive, participatory kind of democracy. If that we all go back to those periods in the early 80s and 70s where unions were seen as the sort of incubators of this radical, more participatory democracy, an alternative kind of system where rank and file really were running the show, worker control. But this was trumped, I would argue, and that wording is meant consciously. This was trumped by the politics of the dominant ally, in this case, the Communist Party and the ANC, the two political parties, precisely because what they said to the workers was, you have to hold off on your struggle. You have to allow us to take democratic control. You have to first of all, you have to fight for us to get there. In other words, and it was the unions along with the civics that were the main people and forces that allowed and forced internally the apartheid state to come to the table and to basically start at least compromising on a range of different things. But once that began to happen, what happened is that obviously the ANC then, as it embraced the neoliberalism and as it embraced things, then it basically said to COSATU and to the union and to the civics and everything else, hold off. Don't organize, don't mobilize, don't resist. We now have control of the state. We will now deliver. And that's exactly what happened. And unfortunately, COSATU fundamentally and the unions more or less accepted it, with some exceptions. So what you saw is some strikes. You saw a strike against VAT. Remember the VAT strike in 1993, 1992, but it was very short-lived. You saw different kinds, but it was never put into it was only so far. We're going to show you the power we have, but we're not going to push it. We're not going to actually make you and force you to take a different decision. We're going to try to convince you that there's a little bit better way of doing things. And as that happened, so too did the BEE and all of the other kinds of neoliberal things in the early 90s begin to envelop the unions. What did we? Fundamental strategic mistake: form investment companies. In 90, there was a huge debate around this, but it was lost. And once the unions decided they were going to join the capitalist game, join the casino, join and use worker monies, the game was over by that stage, because there was no way. You had an absurd situation where the National Union of Mine Workers, the investment company, was making the investments that they had in mining companies themselves were retrenching their own members. I mean, that was the absurdity of it at a certain point. And you see Johnny Copeland and Marcel Golding becoming billionaires out of the Sakau and the Sakau workers' money and using that. And we saw that. So once you join that game, then all you can do is you can throw fits, like you can throw tantrums. And this is what the unions have been doing for the last 15 or 20 years. We'll do a strike, we'll do these things, which are good because they're basically workers at the grassroots that are oftentimes saying these things. But where they're controlled from the top down, They always have an end game, which is we show you the power, we turn the tap on, we turn it off once we get a little bit of, we get the little increase, or we get those kinds of things, but no real fundamental sort of systemic politics there. So I would argue that that is what role do they have now? Well, they're still, unions, and we've got, unfortunately, because of neoliberalism, what we have is majority of the working class, which is now casualized, which is non-unionized, which is non-organized. So the space is open, right, for new kinds of unions. And I say this in all respect to my left comrades who are listening, is that we have to move away from the hierarchical forms of organization. We've got to move away from this thing that we have leaders, we have the general secretary, we have the president, and representative democracy, which takes shop stewards, which are bought off by employers, which move from the rank and file. If we're going to want equality and justice in the broader society, we must practice it within our own organizations. And unions have reproduced the very hierarchies and the very other kinds of things, as many organizations have, that they critique on the outside, but practice on the inside. And this then destroys internal democracy. It destroys. I was told by a unionist not long ago that political education within unions has all but died. Nobody talks about anything anymore. Nobody debates anything anymore. This was the strength of a lot of the unions and the workers, arguing constantly ideas, other kinds of things. And now we have, just follow the line and just get your job, hold on. And of course, neoliberal capitalism has made it much more difficult because workers are simply trying to survive. Just hold on to what they have. So it's not, there is two or three sides to that, but there is potential. There's possibilities for worker organizations. I won't say unions as in the old sense, but new kinds of unions, new kinds of worker formations, new kinds of more horizontal, inclusive, non-patriarchal. It's dominated by men. Big men have got to step back and have got to allow women, in particular, women workers who are the most vulnerable and the most exploited, to take the lead. And this is another area which we haven't even crossed. So I would leave it there, but I'm sure there's much more to say. The ANC and the Freedom Charter, Silvio, your question in terms of two ANCs, and the ANC of the RDP and this white monopoly capital. I don't think there's two ANCs. I think there was one ANC all along, and the ANC that has been the one that I'm talking about is the ANC which has taken power, the ANC which is of the leadership, the ANC which is of the structures. Once the story that I painted, once the capture began, it not only captured the state and everything, it captured the party. So province branches become forms of sites of accumulation where you want to become the branch chairperson so you can get the local tender, or you can get the local, you can get that. So the party itself becomes in service of capital. So all of the ANC throughout, there might be some very good comrades in there still that are trying to do. There's certainly people that might still believe in the kinds of promises that were there. I have no doubt about that, but they are unfortunately a minority. And they are not the ones that have much influence these days. That's confirmed by the last 25, 30 years of the trajectory of the ANC. So I don't think there's any more you can talk about a socialist ANC at all. I don't even think you can talk about a socialist party in South Africa, period. I don't think there is one in the sense of grounded, mass-based, putting workers and poor that are led by those very forces, not by some interlopers that come in to try to use the people for their own purposes. So I would say, for me, I'm giving a lecture not long ago that says 2024 elections, the beginning of the end for the ANC. And I think what we're seeing is the denouement of the ANC it is had 100 and something year trajectory, and it's falling apart. And as a result of these kinds of things, and what comes out of it, we've got MK, we've got EFF, we've got COPE, we've got all sorts of other offshoots that have come out of it over the last 10 or 15 years, and no doubt there'll probably be some more as it dismembers itself. Precisely because you cannot hold a party together in a context of such inequality and everything, where it's only about self-interest and class and personal interest and pursuing. That's why I would argue that, and this is in another realm, that we must watch very closely what happens to MK, because what MK has done is it's concentrated all of those people now into one political party. And so to have an organizational unity and a purpose with people who are out for themselves for the most part is a very high order. It's a very difficult task. Option of least resistance, Tristan. possibly that for me, that would be a sort of a descriptive or qualitative way of maybe describing some of the strategic and tactical choices that are framed by an ideological and systemic realities of particularly strategy and tactics choices. But yes, the very basis of incorporation and accession means that you're not going to fight the battle. If you want to be incorporated and you want to access power, you're going to find ways to do that don't basically piss off those that are already in existent power. You can't take on capital, existent capital, if you want to join it, if you want to be part of the party, if you want to be part of the game, if you want to access the very state. You're not going to recalculate the state. You're not going to revolutionize the state itself. You're going to reproduce it. And all of those things are paths of least resistance. So I would think in qualitative or descriptive terms, it matches much of what I would say has happened. Yeah, I think that's, yeah.
Thanks. I think we're going to take another round of questions, starting with the online participants.
Thanks, Teo. I'll start with I think a request more than a comment from Anonymous. And this person is asking you to please give a name to the entire process you've narrated.
To please do what, sorry?
To give a name to the entire process that you've narrated. They ask this because while it is a South African story that you share, this is what is currently unfolding in Kenya. And then a question from Lara Reddy. According to your estimation, do you think there is hope for a new breed of youth in the ANC? Some I even see who have good intentions within a very toxic political party that basically sold itself to capital. But the historical struggle memory of the ANC and the vote is so strong that do you think, comrade, that there is hope for the youth of the ANC or through any political party or state-run social service like education, for example, facing once again great setbacks because of the South African state? And then we have one more question. Oh, there's a lot of questions here, but I'll just take this one from Tali. Can you reflect on the split in the unions and the aftermath of Marikana, including reactions to it?
Sorry, just say the thing about Marikana again.
Can you reflect on the split in the unions and the aftermath of Marikana?
In the aftermath,
okay. Including the reactions to it. Should I continue?
Yes, please go ahead. Most of our participants are online and I don't see any hands up in the room.
Okay. We have another question from Gwinyai. To what extent can the ANC's decline over the years be attributed to the broader challenges faced by revolutionary parties in Southern Africa, such as ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe and UNIP in Zambia? And then we have a comment from Jane Barrett. To add to Dale's analysis of the COSATU in the alliance, it's important to remember that joining the alliance was not uncontested. There were bitter arguments. The differences continue to resurface within the federation. At the same time, the formation of SAF2 presented the possibility of a radical independent trade union movement. But NUMSA's unilateral establishment of the Workers' Party fragmented any solid independence. I think those are it for now.
Thanks, Siviwe, for the online questions. We have just one. We're going to take one more question in the room, and then we'll close off this round of questions and give Dale an opportunity to respond.
Thank you. In your opinion, do you think the ANC is capable of renewing itself? I mean, specifically, what's your take on their now publicly announced renewal program from their resolution at the last NASDAQ conference? And whether do you think the political education program, are they able to renew that as well? Do you think will it help in their renewal program? As I'm interested, Comrade Dale, in your practical experience as an activist, yeah, thanks.
I think that's,
One last question, and then we'll close this round.
you can take, yeah, that's fine. Mhm.
Hi, sorry, Dale. It's actually not a question. It's a comment.
Sure.
I think what for me was most interesting in this entire lecture is the continuation of white or the continuation of Afrikaner capital in terms of capturing the enclave economy from 1985 to date. It's been brilliant because what you've seen is a replication from a race and a class perspective. But my point is that it's continued with different players.
Right.
Thanks. Was there a hand? Yes.
Just a quick one, Dale.
Sure.
So brilliant, the historical analysis and the fact that this is the roots of state capture are systemic, and then where you ended is that therefore, we're only going to deal with it through system change. So could you talk a bit about, given the fact that I think less than 23% of South African workers are in trade unions, and the fact that the trajectory of state capture is worse and it's more and more threatening to any kind of democracy, and this is global, it's the way business is being done generally. How do we even begin to start dismantling this extremely dangerous system? Because we can't continue, it's dangerous to continue. So we should, critiquing it is one thing, but shouldn't we be talking more about how we pull it apart and form something new? Where do we even start?
Big question. Thank you.
Okay. I'll leave that one until the end. Giving a name to this process. I joke. I call myself a guerrilla academic. So I've never been part of the academy, never been a full-time lecturer, but I go in and out of the academy. But I always give academics a hard time because I always like to name things. I always like to have the names so they can put it down. I'm not sure that we can name this other than there was one section of this book that I called it The Exigencies of Class Struggle. And I'm not sure that captures it at all because, I mean, obviously there's in the context of South Africa, but I would just say the end game of capitalism in some ways, because my sense is that what we've entered into over the last 30 with neoliberal capitalism, which has now dominated the world, generally speaking, in places like Kenya and other structural adjustment programs, you name it, which has created this political and economic repression and closing of space and everything else, is that the dominant nature of sort of, the liberal capitalist model, social contract, everything else is coming to a close. And what we're seeing is we could go on for another few decades, but we're seeing is the dying kicks of that system, and the potential birth of something could be very, very bad, could be something that is, and I'll address that in the context of forward, because I think we are in a particular interregnum right now where the possibilities of things going to the right are actually probably greater than they are of going in a progressive direction. And that then requires a different kind of tactical and strategic approach, as opposed to one where the forces of progress are quite confident and are quite organized and are in society and are pushing, like we had in the 1960s and 70s in particular, at least in before neoliberalism sort of became dominant. So I'm not going to give it a name, but I think maybe hopefully that frames it a little bit. The youth in the ANC, Laura, in the context of my assessment is that the ANC has become the vehicle for personal and class accumulation at every single level. Just look at the ANC Youth League and what it's produced over the last 30 years. Look at the youth. Now, that doesn't mean they're not youth that might be members of the ANC Youth League or otherwise that join the EFF or whatever it is, that don't have a vision for something different, that don't desire something different. But using the ANC as the vehicle to achieve that, I don't think so. I think it has become inveterably corrupt. It is now in the DNA of the organization. It is as I say, the sine qua non. It is absolutely essential. Most people, and again, there are exceptions, but the vast majority now do not join the ANC because they think it's going to make our society better. They join the ANC for the personal and class reasons, and to make a living and to survive, which is, again, somewhat understandable in the context of our larger economy. So I would say to the youth of the ANC that your potential, if you're interested in a systemic challenge, if you're interested in something more radical, if you're interested in everything, don't hop on the old skoro, right, of the ANC. Don't build a new vehicle, build a new one. A truly, youth, where you're not tied to a historical and ideological baggage and an inveterately a system that itself has almost closing in on us. It's eating itself alive in some ways. That's what we're seeing, and we're paying the price as South African citizens and those who live and work in this country. So I would say that no, it's not the way to go. That ties into the question that you ask. Can the ANC renew itself? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think it's gone past that point. And in fact, I would say if there was any sign that there was a possibility of renewal, the very first step in that process would be to deal with the people who have taken everybody for a ride, who have stolen the money, who have done. I got expelled from the Communist Party for trying to be a communist. And I say that because what happened is I told the leadership that they were undermining the SACP's own constitution. They were going against the very workers that they claimed to represent. They were corrupt, they were opportunistic, and they were hypocritical. And unfortunately, I've been proven right in that case, and those who have been expelled, because that's exactly what they've done. They have the working class is at its weakest in the last 30 years that it ever has been, and precisely because of their lack of contribution. So I would say to those that seek, in terms of the renewal of the ANC, is that if you're going to be serious about the possibility of renewal, start where it counts, with yourselves. Make people have you cannot be a renewed organization if you don't implement your own constitution, if you don't implement your own policies. If you're not serious, if you just pick and choose, like I said, which ones, oh yeah, well, that apply. And if you have people in your own ranks that are representing you who are criminals, who have stolen, and including people who have been, should we say, linked with much worse crimes, with murder, with assassinations, with a whole range of other things. I mean, nobody wants to talk about these things because everyone's so afraid right now. You say something, you get taken out. Maybe I'll get taken out tomorrow. Who knows? But whatever. This is where we have to. If you're going to renew, you've got to take a stand. You've got to take a stand, and you've got to be principled and honest in taking that stand. Nowhere has there been any renewal of any revolutionary organization or national liberation movement without people sacrificing that and paving a way for others. So that's in relation to the X question in terms of linking to the national liberation movements and the ANC's own decline. That's precisely what the love of power and money. Let's be clear. ZANU-PF, Frelimo, MPLA, UNIP, all of them. It's, not practicing. And this, I deal with this and there's a shirt that we produced, the organizational work with, it says the personal is political. And what do we mean by that? It means that you have to practice what you preach. And the national liberal movements have been very good at preaching. They have been bad at practicing anything. And as a result, they've gone down the same road. Each of them has gone down the same road with varying different cultural, political, social contexts, but they've all gone down the same road, which is that once you get a hold of that power, you don't want to let go of it, and you'll do anything to keep it. And the more you do, the more you crush democracy, the more you crush dissent, the more you narrow the boundaries. And that's the fundamental lineage of a lot. It's the tragic lineage, because it wasn't always that way. There was much more promise. And so if for those people who want to recapture, let's use this terminology, who want to recapture and who want to reclaim, right? And this is where the question comes in around dismantling the system, and where do we start? And I try to address this, and let me just preface my comments by saying this, is I'm not going to, which is sometimes what people want to hear, and I'm not saying Anita, I know you don't want to hear this at all. It's not you per se as asking the question, but a lot of people want to hear that there's this model and solution that we have, and all we've got to do is implement it. This is a situation which has plagued the left, which is we've got all the answers, just come onto our program and we'll lead the way. We're the vanguard, we'll move. This has produced again and again the very same relationships of oppression and intolerance and everything. So if we understand that, then we start with inclusivity and unity. We start with breaking down this territorialism amongst progressives, and whether it's within civil society, and people accept we can disagree, but do we have a common vision? And concentrate on the commonalities, not the differences. The progressives and the left always want to oh my gosh, we'll split and we'll argue and argue over the most finest details, but nobody else cares. Nobody else cares about what those splits and all those finer ideological points and everything else. And we're here in Rosa-Luxemburg, which is, and Rosa-Luxemburg is experiencing something very similar in Germany with the split in Die Linke, where you've got people, and this is creating huge problems for working class and progressive struggles, because people are more interested in kowtowing to a sort of like populist demagogic kind of politics than they are in practicing principle. So it's about being principled, it's about being inclusive, it's about being tolerant, and building structures that are independent of existing political parties and existing structures. So this is a tall order. And I say this from experience because I've been part of trying to build those movements, trying. And they have foundered, every single one of them has foundered on the rocks of egoism, of corruption, and of personal accumulation, in other words, of people. And the only way you can do that in an organization is when it rears its head, you deal with it. If you don't deal with it, it is a cancer that will take over. And much progressive for the ANC and everything, when it reared its head, when the arms deal came up to the surface in 1993, it should have been smashed right then. It wasn't, it was embraced, it opened the door. It opened the door. And once the arms deal was there, everyone's like, let's go for the party. Let's get in there. And the same happens in progressive organizations. If you don't deal, then ordinary good people will say, I don't want to be part of who you are. It's like Emma Goldman. If I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution. We've got to be inclusive and tolerant and unify around what we agree on. We can debate and argue, but we've got to get beyond ourselves. We've got to get beyond our egos and other things. And connecting the climate, the economic, the social, and that's what I mean by inclusive, not just on a personal, but a systemic level. And we act in silos, and this is something that's not new. Everybody knows this. Our biggest weakness as progressives is that we have a territory, and then we protect it, because we trying to obviously almost say, no, you can't be part of this, or no, you can't come onto my territory. If we begin to build an inclusive kind of politics, I think we'll hopefully get beyond that. And I think the youth are absolutely central to this, because some of the youth that I see don't hold the baggage that some of my generation holds and everything else. They are much more inclusive. They're much more tolerant. They're much more willing to experiment, everything else. So it's in the youth that this must be, and they're much more inclusive on a range, and the promises of our Constitution that are progressive. I think they would be the ones that are more than capable than my generation and our generation to begin to realize and to change the system. So I know that is an inadequate answer. And I know that it's not sometimes satisfying, but we have to start there. I think it's laying the foundations, because here's the crux, and let me just end with this, is that when I say the personal is political, if we don't build the kind of relationship that we want to see in society amongst ourselves, we're never going to get there. Never. So that's what, and that it's about relations building and building. So it's, instead of looking at, let's build a party, let's build a mass movement, how about let's just build functioning relationships amongst ourselves, and ones that are of respect, of tolerance, of inclusivity, and let's see where that goes. And I think we'd be surprised. I think we'll be surprised once we start breaking down those barriers and those things that we've erected. We could be surprised, and letting it go without any preconceived notions. Last one, Jane's, the Saftu Numsa, the unions, the split in the unions, and the aftermath of Marikana. Yeah, I mean, these were very, besides Marikana obviously being and I don't need to talk about anything, I don't think, more about what Marikana represented. And I think everybody, understands that particular point in South African history, post-apartheid South African history. But what I would argue, the reasons why there was the initial split, the reason is precisely for the very same reasons that affected the ANC, the disease of egotism, of power, of wanting to get into position and power, all of these things. So when you get a general secretary of a union that basically says that anybody who disagrees with me is going to get dealt with, then you know what's going to happen in that union. You're going to silence the people are going to, you create a cult. You create a following around a particular individual, a big man. And that is one of the aspects that has happened in many, many unions, where damn the membership. I mean, there was no more better example than this, than the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party that NUMSA came with. NUMSA, 350,000 members, and they got 27,000 votes for the party. That should tell you everything about egos and lack of respect for your own rank and file, and not speaking on behalf of people, and within a union that supposedly practices democracy and supposedly speaks on behalf of its members, but unilaterally moves ahead in a case which leaves people behind. And I think that's what we see in the splits is, some of it was personal. Let's be honest. Some of it was personal relationships gone wrong as well. And, when the old adage, when the elephants fight, the grass suffers. In that case, I think in some unions that's been the case. The investment companies were a result, the complete disintegration of accountability within the unions. Samwu is a classic example of Samwu. 120 million stolen and used for houses and luxury cars and bodyguards and everything. And then when people pointed out, they hired private security to shoot and attack workers, their own leadership. That's the kind of politics that we're seeing in unions. I call it Tsotsi politics. That's what it is. It's mafia politics. Just what we're seeing with all the mafias that are moving in that case. And unions, some of the unions, unfortunately, have experienced that. So in that sense, it's the same lesson for unions as it is for a lot of the others, is this practice of going back to the base, going back to the very promise of what unions represented, which was the bottom-up democracy, worker control, these kinds of things. And workers themselves they're going to have to be at the forefront. And the key to that, I would argue, is breaking down the barrier between permanent workers and casualized workers. This barrier has to be broken down. Most unions, I did a study 2 years ago of mapping the world of casualized work in South Africa, and I found that not a single union is organizing hardly any casualized workers. Or where they have, they've abandoned the attempt. There was an attempt with some domestic work, with some others to do this. But unless that is broken down, what is going to happen is unions will become more and more isolated from the actual working class, which has become casualized and vulnerable. And you'll just protect what you got, and you become very conservative in doing so. So they've got to break that barrier for the possibilities of renewal within unions and within worker formations and worker struggles. And I think that is possible. I think if anywhere it is possible, precisely because the conditions of workers, the socioeconomic and conditions of workers are getting worse. They're not getting better. So there's every reason for workers, every reason to turn. And this is where the progressive politics comes in, which we could go, workers, as we saw in rise of fascism in Europe, rise of fascism right now in India, with Hindu fascism and other forms of fascism. We see it's working class people that are being pulled into that as a result of their desperation and as a result of the fear and fear-mongering and displacement and scapegoating and all sorts of other kinds of things, with religion and few other things sort of masking that. So our work is cut out for us. We have a huge, huge, huge tasks ahead. Not easy, but possible.
Thank you. On that note, I think I would further break down the need to cover casualized workers, to highlight migrant workers. I think across all sectors in South Africa,
Absolutely.
they're a highly marginalized group. Last point that I wanted to ask, question rather, sort of taking advantage of my role as the moderator. I mean, there's a very popular view in the media that the GNU configuration could help curb state capture. Is this a naive view, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. What I would say is this. I would say in the short term, that if there are those who are part of the GNU, right? If there are those in the state and in the bureaucracy and everything else who are emboldened to act against corruption, or emboldened to be whistleblowers, or emboldened to do some things, or at least get some of the basics working again, then we can't be against that. You can't sort of say, oh, well, it's wrong if because the Department of Home Affairs minister is DA minister, if the Department of Home Affairs actually becomes a little bit more efficient, that's a bad thing because it's DA minister, which is what, some of the other political parties would say. And then, of course, they get in there and it gets even worse. So in that sense, I think we have to orient towards where ordinary people are. And in my experience with workers and poor and people who are on the ground, I just finished a 5-day political school with 16 organizations from Gauteng, KZN, Northwest, and these are poor communities mostly and others. And we sat back and listened the whole fight, and what people were having to say. And the one thing that came through clearly is that people want practical solutions now, right? They can't eat the ideology, can't eat the revolutionary thing there. They want practical. So if there's parts of the GNU that and certain individuals that can make a progress on that front, fine, let's welcome it and let's push and open if the gate is open, let's go through it and push it further and further. So any serious activist always takes advantage of those spaces. You take advantage of the space. You don't turn your back because it's not ideologically pure. You take the space and you move with it. So that's what I would say. But I would say in the broader sense, the GNU is not the vehicle. It's not ever going to be the vehicle because it is a product. It is the child of all the things that I've talked about. It's just a different form of it. Yeah. So the very same people and everything else. But I believe what it represents in some ways is the beginning, when I say the beginning, not just on the ANC side, but the beginning of opening certain doors. Now we have a situation for the first time since 1994, right, where our political and a system is much more open than it ever has been. This provides possibilities for the right wing and the demagogues and the fascists, but it also provides possibilities for progressives and for other people. So while critiquing the GNU, while understanding its nature, its neoliberal capitalist nature, while understanding its class formation, everything else, and fighting that, it's also doing more than that. The critique is not enough. It's got to be a practical politics that takes advantage of the spaces that might open up as a result and push those through to make a difference in people's lives. Because once a difference is made in people's lives, people then start believing that they can have other things that work, that there's possibilities. That builds confidence, that builds movements, that builds the possibilities of more systemic change. So that would be my answer.
Okay. Thank you for that. I would like to express my gratitude to everyone who participated, both those who joined here in person and those who joined virtually. And a big thank you to you, Dale. We appreciate you sharing your knowledge and your expertise. And we're grateful for this brilliant lecture. It's been an inspiring one. And I hope that it's also been enlightening for everybody that joined. Before we close the session officially, I just wanted to announce that in this series, we have 4 other dialogues coming up. And the next one will be a hybrid one, but hosted in Maputo, I believe. It's on the 27th of September. And the topic is democracy within the context of AI. And this upcoming dialogue will be followed by a virtual one on the 10th of October, looking at far-right politics in Europe. And then we'll have our last hybrid event here in our Johannesburg office again. This will be on the 25th of October. And the topic is BRICS, the G20 and climate catastrophe beyond the imperial and sub-imperial alliance. And then the series will be concluded with a virtual event on the 8th of November. And I hope that you'll be able to make time and participate in those events. Thanks so much.